People think they're mentally strong. They think they make their own decisions, think for themselves, stand by their convictions. They look at people who follow crowds or cave under pressure and think, I'm not like that. I question things. I have my own opinions. I don't just accept what I'm told. This is the story most people tell themselves about their own minds, that they're independent thinkers, rational, strong-willed. That weak-mindedness is something that happens to other people, the gullible, the followers, the ones who can't think for themselves. But not them. Never them. Until something happens that reveals the truth. Most people, even the ones who think they're strong-minded, are operating on borrowed thoughts, unexamined beliefs, and conditioned responses they've never questioned. And the system that creates this weakness is so subtle, so pervasive, that by the time you notice it, it's already shaped everything you think you believe. We live in a culture that celebrates the illusion of independent thinking. Social media tells us to be yourself. Think different. Question everything. We share posts about critical thinking, about not being sheep, about standing up for what we believe in. Education tells us we are learning to think, not what to think. That we are being taught to analyze, to evaluate, to form our own conclusions. The entire modern identity is built on the premise that we are all independent thinkers making our own choices. We believe this completely. We look at historical examples of mass conformity, cults, totalitarian regimes, propaganda campaigns, and think, that couldn't happen to me. I'd see through it. We look at people who blindly follow trends and think, I'm more discerning than that. We see someone change their opinion based on social pressure and think, I stand by my convictions. The culture has convinced us that we are strong-minded, that we are the exception, the critical thinker in a world of followers. And this belief, this certainty that we are mentally strong, is exactly what makes us weak. Because the strongest form of mental weakness is not knowing you have it. Here's what nobody tells you. Most people aren't thinking their own thoughts. They're repeating thoughts they've absorbed from their environment and mistaking repetition for reasoning. They're not weak-minded because they're stupid. They're weak-minded because they've never been taught to recognize the difference between thinking and being thought through. Mental weakness isn't about intelligence. It's about awareness. And most people lack the awareness to see how deeply conditioned their minds actually are. Consider this. Your political opinions, are they yours? Or did you inherit them from your parents, your community, your social circle, and then spend years finding evidence to justify beliefs you never actually examined? Your values, are they chosen? Or are they the default settings of the culture you were raised in, accepted without question because everyone around you accepted them too? Your preferences, your tastes, your judgments, how many of them did you actively decide on, and how many did you just absorb through exposure and repetition? Most people go through their entire lives without ever asking these questions. They think because they can articulate their opinions, those opinions are theirs. But articulation isn't understanding. Conviction isn't examination. You can be deeply certain about something you've never actually thought through. And that certainty, that unexamined confidence, is the hallmark of a weak mind. A strong mind questions itself. A weak mind mistakes confidence for correctness. A strong mind can hold uncertainty. A weak mind needs certainty to feel safe. A strong mind can change when presented with better information. A weak mind digs in harder when challenged. Most people have weak minds not because they lack the capacity for strength, but because they've never developed it. And the system they live in actively discourages them from developing it. He thought he was a critical thinker. He read. He questioned things. He didn't just accept what he was told. He'd have long debates with people, arguing his positions with conviction and evidence. He felt intellectually strong. Until one day, someone asked him a simple question, why do you believe that? And he gave his answer. A good answer. Well-reasoned. Backed by facts. And they asked again, but why do you believe that reasoning? Where did that framework come from? And he realized, he didn't know. He'd never questioned the underlying assumptions his entire worldview was built on. He'd questioned conclusions, sure. He'd debated interpretations. He'd argued about applications. But he'd never questioned the foundational beliefs that determined how he interpreted everything. Those beliefs had been installed early, by family, by culture, by the random circumstances of where and when he was born. And he'd spent decades building elaborate justifications on top of those foundations without ever examining whether the foundations themselves were solid. He thought he was thinking. He was actually defending pre-installed programming. That's when he started seeing it everywhere. People who could defend their positions brilliantly but couldn't explain why they'd adopted those positions in the first place. People who could articulate complex arguments but fell apart when you questioned their premises. People who were intellectually sophisticated within their worldview but had never questioned whether that worldview itself made sense. They weren't thinking. They were processing within predetermined boundaries. And they didn't even know the boundaries were there. He was faced with a choice. Keep operating the way he always had, confident in his beliefs, certain of his reasoning, comfortable in his intellectual identity. Or do something terrifying. Actually examine the foundations. Question the assumptions. Admit that most of what he thought was his own thinking was actually inherited programming. The first option was easier. Felt safer. Let him maintain his self-image as a critical thinker. The second option meant admitting he'd been weak-minded. That he'd been operating on autopilot while believing he was fully conscious. Most people, when faced with this choice, choose the first option. Because weak-mindedness is comfortable. It gives you certainty, community, the validation of everyone around you who believes the same things. Strong-mindedness is uncomfortable. It means standing alone sometimes, being uncertain, having to rebuild your entire framework of understanding from the ground up. It means admitting you were wrong about things you were certain about. And most people would rather be certain and wrong than uncertain and growing. He chose differently, not because he was special, but because the discomfort of living with unexamined thoughts had finally become greater than the discomfort of examining them. What he discovered was disturbing. The system that creates weak-mindedness isn't external oppression. It's comfort. We are not weak-minded because we are being controlled by some authoritarian force. We are weak-minded because thinking is hard, and the system offers us thousands of ways to avoid doing it. Pre-packaged opinions for every issue. Echo chambers that confirm what we already believe. Algorithms that show us more of what we already agree with. Tribal identities that give us ready-made positions on everything. Social pressure that punishes deviation. Reward systems that celebrate confidence over accuracy. The system doesn't force you to be weak-minded. It just makes weak-mindedness the path of least resistance. And most people take it without realizing there was another option. This is why most people are weak-minded. Not because they're stupid. Not because they can't think. But because they've never been taught that thinking is a practice, not a trait. They believe that because they have a brain, they're thinking. But thinking, real thinking, the kind that actually examines assumptions and questions foundations, is a skill that requires practice. And most people never practice it. They go through life consuming opinions, repeating beliefs, defending positions, and calling that thinking. But it's not. It's processing. It's rationalizing. It's justifying. Real thinking is uncomfortable. It requires holding multiple contradictory ideas. It requires admitting you might be wrong. It requires questioning things you're certain about. Most people avoid this discomfort their entire lives. They build their identity around their beliefs instead of building beliefs around truth. And once your identity is tied to your beliefs, examining those beliefs feels like self-destruction. So they don't. They protect their beliefs instead of testing them. They seek confirmation instead of challenge. They build walls around their mind instead of opening doors. And they call this strength. But it's not strength. It's fragility masquerading as conviction. A strong mind can be challenged without feeling threatened. A weak mind treats every challenge as an attack. A strong mind can say, "I don't know," or "I was wrong." A weak mind would rather double down than admit error. A strong mind is flexible, adaptable, constantly updating. A weak mind is rigid, defensive, desperately clinging to certainty. Most people have weak minds not because they're incapable of strength, but because they've never developed the muscles. They've never practiced holding uncertainty. Never practiced changing their mind. Never practiced examining their own thoughts. They've just accepted whatever thoughts appeared in their head and assumed those thoughts were them. But thoughts aren't you. There's something happening to you. And until you learn to observe your thoughts rather than being controlled by them, you'll remain weak-minded. No matter how intelligent you are. No matter how well you can argue. No matter how certain you feel. The system that creates weak-mindedness isn't a conspiracy. It's just the natural result of a culture that values comfort over growth, certainty over truth, and defending positions over discovering understanding. And most people never escape it. Not because they can't, but because they don't realize they need to. They think they are already strong-minded. And that belief is exactly what keeps them weak.